Thank you, Chairman and the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Fiji National University. Rather lengthy introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge our host for today, the School of Journalism, Ms. Zakir Khan, and all the journalists who are here with us today. Beloved Akan, a very good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not intend to make a very long speech, but essentially to highlight a number of issues that needs to be discussed and probably thought about. You have, of course, after me, a number of very experienced journalists, people who have been within the system for a number of decades now. I completely concur with the Chairman of the Council that it really should be called World Media Freedom Day as opposed to press. Of course, when it all started, it was the press only. You did not actually have emails and electronic transactions, electronic means of communicating information and disseminating information. Of course, radio too was not necessarily something that everybody had. In Fiji, many of you may not realize that in order for you to have a wireless, as it was called then, which is now transformed into the company called Wirelessy, you actually had to have a license to actually have a radio. And only people who had licenses actually could have access to a radio. So the radio, in fact, was also a luxury. But of course, today in Fiji, we have something like 500,000 smartphones in operation today. We have today now more SIM cards in operation than actual number of people in Fiji. So your ability to access information either through mobile broadband, access to internet, Viber, Facebook, etc., and the ability to access that information has become a lot more readily available. People now, of course, can access information. That's not to say, of course, that all information is accurate. It's not, of course, to say that all information has the level of integrity that it requires for it to be what one may call not even newsworthy, but to be able to be dependent upon. The context of Press Freedom Day or Media Freedom Day, as we discussed now, came about essentially vis-a-vis the state. Because generally the media organization that did spring up, if you look at the history of it, was all about the publication of information that may not necessarily be seen as information that the state or the powers that be wanted published. So it has always been in relation to the state, generally speaking. Of course, now in the modern day world, press freedom is not only about the perhaps antagonistic or the two protagonists, which is the state and the journalists, but it's also about corporate interests. It's also about other political interests. You'll see in many parts of the world where you do actually have perhaps journalists being affected by those who want to suppress their right to publish. It's not generally the state, but it will also be big corporations. In many parts of the world, you'll see many companies that try and suppress. In cases, for example, you have even trade unions that try and suppress, or other large self-interest groups. You have some feudalistic societies. You'll find, for example, large families wanting to suppress media freedom. So this is the type of sort of, the protagonists are within this scope of, the behavior or the rights and freedoms that people may have as far as the media is concerned. So in Fiji, I think we have a very limited view about freedom of media. We always think it's always vis-a-vis the state. And therefore, I think that conditioning actually leads to an obfuscation of the real realities that exist within modern day Fiji. It essentially means that people somehow or the other think that other interests may not necessarily have an influence on how a media organization presents its views and how a media organization may be influenced by other interests. And I hope that the journalists can actually talk about that. Aiyaz Sayed, who some of you may know, was not just an academic. He's known to be one of the creme de la creme of the intelligentsia that existed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was somebody who very much challenged the issues facing media organizations. He had, of course, had other spheres of work. but he also talked about what he called the representations of an intellectual, a very well-known BBC lecture series. And he gave a lecture series called Representation of Intellectual. It's actually been put in a book form. It's only about 50 or 60 pages. I urge you to read that book. And he, in that piece, actually talks about how it is so critically important for the intelligentsia, or in Fiji generally call them academics, but not all academics, of course, apart from the intelligentsia. Some may actually lack intelligence in the first place. But the point of the matter is that the intelligentsia, whenever they actually provide a critical assessment of any topic, they must ensure that they are actually free not just from any influence by people physically influencing them, but even in your mindset. Your mind needs to be free. You should not be driven by particular prejudices that you may actually unconsciously be not aware of, that is actually unconsciously influencing you to write, unconsciously influencing you to assess particular events in a particular manner. The reality is that Fiji is a former colonial country. We were colonized by the British for about 96 years. They gave us an infrastructure that currently, or was post-independence, hugely lacking. They gave us also a system of government. They gave us an electoral system. They actually put in place various policies and measures that divided our people, that had an electoral system that actually divided our people. There were schools in Fiji that were based on ethnicity. So you had what you call in those days the Fijian schools, you had the Indian schools, and then you had all the schools where all the Kailomas went to. This is fundamentally the way our society was structured. So what does that mean? It means that many people who have come through a particular system will be influenced, consciously or subconsciously, by that way of thinking. There are many people, of course, who will pass on that way of thinking to their children and the children's children. So if you have a journalist that may have a pre-colonial way or pre-colonial state way of thinking, or I should say a pre-independent way of thinking, then that will affect the way that they view what is news. It will affect the way what they construct to be news. They will then be able to not necessarily represent all the views because their views are influenced by this old way of thinking. That's just one example. Our emphasis on what should be the priorities of the state, our emphasis on what we should report as the priorities of the state becomes very much influenced by the old way of thinking. So in this context, I do not necessarily envy journalists, in particular in states that were actually occupied by colonial powers. The journalists actually have a huge burden, in fact. You have not necessarily been operating or have been influenced by an environment where they have had freedoms like in America from a colonial structure for nearly, 200, 300 years. Fiji, we just became independent in 1970. There are other states in this part of the world that became independent much later than Fiji. So the way of thinking, the analysis is very much skewed by or influenced by what actually happened in the pre-independent state. So I think I just want to provide the thought. The two critical issues is that what are the influences that actually influence a journalist, or even for that matter, media organizations. And secondly, that the protagonists are not the press or the media organizations in the state. There are other protagonists within this whole sphere of influence and how a media organization or how journalists actually write or interpret what is news or interpret events that actually become news. In the same way, for example, therefore, if a particular event takes place, if you're driven by some of these prejudices, you'll only go to one or two select people to comment on that particular event. It's a huge impact on the way that we view news. As has been highlighted, that a free and independent, responsible, accountable media is a cornerstone in any democracy. It is very, very important. Of course, we have the Fijian constitution that actually guarantees that. In section 17, it says that under the title of freedom of speech and expression, publication recognizes that every person has the right to freedom of speech, expression, thought, opinion, and publication, which includes the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, knowledge, and ideas. So it's not the ability to only to seek it and receive it, but also to impart the information, knowledge, and ideas. Freedom of the press, including print. So this is the definition here in the Constitution. It says freedom of the press, including print, electronic, and other media. Freedom of imagination and creativity. That is very important. We've never had that in any other constitution before in Fiji. We need to have the ability of imagination and creativity. And I would actually, personally, I feel very strongly about this area, because really in Fiji, the level of critical thinking, the ability to think outside the box, the ability to have that imagination regarding what constitutes our society, what constitutes our contemporary society, is very much lacking. I mean, you can see that even when you go and look at various paintings in Fiji. If you just look at the works of art that are hung up in galleries, if you go to Rock Market, you see it is very, very limited. The representations are very limited. The people that are represented in the art is very limited. We have generally, only one or two themes that we seem to stick on. Where are the representations of the young people if you see most of the art? Very few. Where is the imagination, creativity in that? You only get it maybe in some school competition. But in mainstream art, it's not there. How have we developed our drama? Do you people maybe do drama? Do we have courses available in drama? Do we have plays in Fiji that actually represent or talk about contemporary issues that may be facing us? I mean, you have the Kula Film Awards, where you have these high school students that actually make some short films. But what are we doing beyond that and mainstreaming that? These are very critical issues. And of course, and lastly, academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. However, as it says, the freedom of speech, expression, thought, opinion, and publication does not protect propaganda for war, incitement to violence or insurrection against the Constitution, or advocacy of hatred that is based on any prohibited ground of discrimination and constitutes incitement to cause harm. Now, what are the prohibited grounds of discrimination? So, the prohibited grounds of discrimination is race, culture, ethnic or social origin, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, language, economic, social or health status, disability, age, religion. Even in section 26, you have pregnancy, marital status. All of those grounds are grounds where you can have discrimination, and nobody should be discriminated on that basis. We of course have today in Fiji one of the most robust laws pertaining to HIV and people who have HIV. And in fact, we've got many countries taking samples of our law to look at it. This was drafted prior to 2014. So we have to ensure that you cannot have freedom on one hand, but use that freedom to actually carry out unfair discrimination. In the same way, for example, you cannot, as has been under the common law, use that freedom to be able to defame people. That's been there for time immemorial. So if somebody, for example, may be standing in front of a hotel that may be used 24/7 on an hourly basis, and you may be walking past that hotel, and if you take a photograph and you put that on the front page, I may be able to sue that particular media organization because they are trying to defame you by making a particular representation. In the same way, we see a lot of this that's taking place now in social media. I was just day before yesterday listening to in Australia at the moment. They've made a research about how, for example, you have people who are couples. They may take some photos, compromising photos of each other. Is done in good taste at that point in time. But then when things develop into the relationship not being so good, and how people are using those images now to defame other people by spreading through social media, it does not fall necessarily in the directly perhaps in the social, in the freedom of the press. But the fact is that these are some of the situations that are now arising. So you need to be able to look at these situations vis-a-vis also the media, as to how that could be used and how the media can be using that type of information. So sometimes the misinformation is not necessarily in the form of pictures or images, it's also in the form of words. And unfortunately today, if you look at the way that social media is used in Fiji, it seems to be operating without any rules. I'm not saying there needs to be legislative rules. I'm talking about the ethical standards that must be engaged in these areas. We recently had a case where you had a person who sued successfully somebody because of representations made in social media. I think it was on Facebook. Now, that's the first case we've had in Fiji where we've actually had somebody successfully prosecuting a defamation case in that respect. Prosecution not in the criminal sense, but in the civil sense. In other countries, of course, the jurisprudence has developed a lot better. I was recently told that the German cabinet has recently approved a law to be tabled before their parliament where there'll be very heavy penalties against ISP providers if they fail to remove information from any of those, Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, if that information is hugely defamatory, if that information is inciting people, if that information misrepresents negatively on the state of Germany. Now, I understand it's going to become law very soon, and the penalties are like in hundreds of millions of dollars for these large corporations if they do not monitor this. Because I think a lot of the countries in Europe actually are now recognizing as to what is the damage and the extent of the damage that is being caused by such publications. So these are some of the things that you may need to also think about and consider. And I think the idea is not an over-regulation in this space, but the idea is actually to have some standards about it. And of course, the media is the one that can set the standards. Because what we do find is that some media organizations in Fiji run along with this information that's already provided on social media. They see that, one, as either the truth without doing any research, two, it may necessarily suit their agenda, or three, it's just a very lazy form of journalism. So they say, we found this in social media. The moment they print it, of course, half the people start believing it. Is it responsible to do that? Is it ethical to do that? Just put yourself in that position. Assuming somebody prints something about in social media, publishes something about you personally, about you or your family, and if the media organization picks that up and runs along with it, putting it as a story and trying to sort of get that balance and say, well, we're printing only what was in social media, half the people will believe it. Put yourself in that position. What do you think you will feel? What do you think of that information being published? Is the media organization being responsible or not? Isn't there a standard that the media organization must follow? And as has been highlighted, for example, that under the Media Industry Development Act, we actually have a code of conduct for the media organizations. And that code of conduct, ladies and gentlemen, was in fact borrowed verbatim, in other words, word for word, from the code of ethics for the media organization that existed prior to the Media Industry Development Act. Existed prior to that, and in fact that code of ethics was put together by the media organizations themselves. And that was, as has been highlighted, about accuracy, balance, fairness. It's about, of course, some media organizations, as we know, that they think just to get a balance, because they have a particular agenda, they may run 5 paragraphs of what the other person said and only 2 lines of what you said. They think that's balance. It's not necessarily balance. Balance is not about reporting what person said, and unfortunately this is one thing that I do want to comment. In Fiji, a lot of journalists think that being a journalist means saying, he said that, she said that, and that's the story. It's not. That's why I actually don't spend hours reading newspapers in Fiji. I'm sorry to say, Fiji Times and Fiji Sun. I like reading newspapers when I go to countries like even Australia, or even countries like India has got a very robust media organization space. In other countries, even USA, they actually do analysis. Even if it's a story, the current thing is about sugar, what they have done is they go around and say, this is the announcement, some people are not happy with it, and that's it. They have not had the intellectual input of their own. They cannot stand on their own feet and say, they've said this is the announcement made, we believe this is what the story is, or we believe that this is what it is. Be bold enough and have the intellectual gumption to actually carry out that analysis yourself. That is what is lacking in Fiji. That intellectual input is lacking, and the ability to stand on your own 2 feet. As I've said previously, also in other places, where we don't actually have, for example, people in the accounting profession or in the economic profession who actually can stand up and give you an impartial assessment from their professional perspective of, say, for example, the budget. We don't even go out and seek the opinions. It's always like, well, that academic is that for a political party and that academic is for that political party. We don't have a space where people can actually stand up as a lawyer and say, well, this is the law, we believe that this is the interpretation of this, and in our assessment, this is what it legally means. Or, this is how the budget has been delivered. If you look at this particular allocation, it will mean, yes, it's good for the economy, it will create jobs. But this allocation, we think it will mean X, Y, Z. We don't have people doing that. And also, of course, given our our colonial history, people also, some people till today in Fiji, if that particular person is an accountant and may give the opinion, half the people think, oh, because he's doing that because he's an Indo-Fijian. Or because that person is a Itauke, that's why they're saying that, you see. Has the media tried to break those kind of stereotypes? Have they tried to stop us from thinking that way? What kind of active roles have they taken to ensure that we have actual true nation building, that everybody is a Fijian? In fact, one of the media organizations, the newspapers, refused to call the Fijian Elections Office the Fijian Elections Office. Even though in law, it stated that it is called the Fijian Elections Office because they believe the word Fijian election should not be used. And they repeatedly, until a very short period of time ago, continued to call the Fijian Elections Office the Fiji Elections Office. This is the kind of recalcitrance that you see in the intellectual input by some media organizations in Fiji. The other aspect, of course, is that we need to be able to ensure privacy. We need to ensure about discrimination, as I mentioned, there should not be discrimination. We need to protect our children. The way that we represent news, the way that we represent facts. Of course, victims in sexual cases, how they are presented. In fact, people in criminal cases. Previously, of course, in some media organizations, they used to say, our Fijian man was seen fleeing the scene. An Indian man was doing this. This is how it was reported before. It fulfills prejudices. I remember once I went to CFL many years ago. This has nothing to do with CFL at that time. But we were drinking grog. And I remember sitting around there, Nunu Sende and all of that. And I told a story. And this person actually worked as a journalist too. And I was telling them a story. I thought it was some news to share. I said, hey, you know, this guy from Fiji in King's Cross got recently charged for murder. And he was a bouncer. First question I got asked. This is back in the 90s. Indian fella, Fijian fella? I refused to answer. Because for me, as far as even those days too, as far as I was concerned, he's a Fijian. He's a citizen of our country, and that's what should concern us. All night he pestered me. He could not get over the fact that I did not tell him what ethnicity that person was. And this guy was a journalist. Actually, still is a journalist. You see, so my point is this. The media plays a very pivotal role in a developing society like Fiji. 69.4% of the entire Fijian population is below the age of 40. All of these people sitting on the stage are in the minority. All of you at the back are in the majority except for one or two of you. That is the reality, ladies and gentlemen. And the reality is that in order to build a strong nation state, we need to be able to forge ahead on a basis that provides a level playing field for everybody. And in this context, I mean in terms of the information or dissemination of information. And in this context, I also mean in means of the analysis of the information. It must be done truly independently, intellectually independently. That's very important. I have a very another issue that I think that linked to what I said about the lack of investigative journalism in Fiji. Investigative journalism does not only mean about investigating crime. It's about generally investigative journalism. How many times has Fiji Sun or Fiji Times done a 2-page article? So let's talk about the sugar industry, let's talk about some other industry, independently of their own. You get opinion pieces by people with a particular political proclivity writing it. How many of them have independently done that? How many of them have gone, and since the 1970s, and for example, I talk about sugar industry, it's very topical at the moment, looked at sugarcane production and done an analysis of it. What affected it? How many of them have done an analysis of how much money has been put in by the government? What does that mean? Since the 1970s. What happened to sugarcane production in 1824? How many of you know that the CSR in Fiji actually subsidized the sugar industry in Queensland for decades? Because the Fijian sugar industry actually made a lot more money than what they made in Queensland. How many people know that? How many people know that 50% of all the sugarcane farm leases weren't renewed in the 1990s? And a lot of them now live between Suvarnasori corridor. That's why you have all the Lambasa people cheering for Lambasa when they play in Zakambau Park. They're all here. You see, nobody does this analysis. Nobody puts this into perspective. So the ordinary person who wants to know about the sugar industry needs to have this information. And at the end of the day, they can make their own call. I very strongly feel that I think the journalists in Fiji have always been underpaid. I want to make that point. I was told by a former editor of Fiji Times, when I talked to him, he's no longer around, when I said to him, why are you underpaying your journalists so much? And this is sometime in 2008. He said, well, why should I if I can pick them up for $7,000 or $8,000 a year? Because you see, for them, a journalist meant somebody who just went to court, so-and-so appeared in court, charged for abuse, this was the sentence. See, this is why I also see that in the questions that we get from journalists. When we have a press conference, the standard question, how much did it cost? How many people will be affected? That's the extent of questions. I have so many people who come and are present with us in press conferences, and at the end of the press conference they'll turn around and look at me and say, are these all the questions they'll ask? Because the people who actually do get sent to these press conferences, they're not even specialized in those areas. Elana Basilala worked for FERCA. She maybe does some work on FERCA. But what's the extent of specialization in journalists? How many media companies have actually sent their journalists overseas and say, you'll be writing for our finance section, we want you to go and do 1-year course in finance. Really know what the hell the bond market operates? How does it function? How many people have been trained? Why should journalists be paid so little money? In fact, some media organizations will lament to you today, there's not many good quality journalists around. There may be one or two bright, shining stars. People like Vijay Narayan have been around for a long time. His depth and his knowledge of the Fijian situation, if you compare him to many other journalists, miles ahead. But is it correct that he should be the only one upon whom we depend on this? That level of analysis? No. There's a gap, there's a void. And I think because a lot of people don't necessarily see journalism as a good career path. I don't know, some of you that may be studying here, how many journalists actually do become true journalists? How many of them actually may end up as PR people? A lot of firms now have PR people, media people. They end up working as that. I feel very strongly that Journalists in Fiji have been significantly underpaid by the private sector. There's been a lack of investment in journalists. And some journalists, because of the need to feel important, get used by a lot of politicians. They have developed very close relationships with them. We see that all the time. The level of analysis is lacking as a result of that. I think the other point that I also wanted to make is I've highlighted earlier on, just going on the standards. Again, the standard says that you cannot, for example, use ethnicity or religion. You need to be sensitive about that, not to have any of those kind of, demarcators being used in doing up stories. The Media Industry Tribunal, of course, a lot has been said about it in Parliament. You should note that despite all the waffle, there has been no prosecution of any media organization for the breach of the Code of Ethics of editorial content. None whatsoever. He had one media organization that was charged in the Media Industry Development Act in terms of the ownership requirements. That's it, nothing else. There were certain provisions that did exist pertaining to penalties for journalists. Those have been removed also. So you see, today what I find quite ironic, that some of the politicians who talk about, the Media Industry Development Decree or Act must go, and say because there's no freedom of the media, but they are the ones who are already every day in the media. They are the ones who are very freely making those comments. It's quite paradoxical to say, I don't have any freedom, but you have the right to make all those noises about it. Obviously they have the freedom to do that. So there's a political sort of spin to that. But the development of jurisprudence in Fiji, of course, we have a very well-known case in respect of, for example, contempt by the media. We have the famous Ty Nicholas case. I don't know how many of you know about that. The Ty Nicholas case was the Supreme Court of Fiji recently, actually I'm talking about this because the Supreme Court of Fiji recently dismissed an appeal by Fiji Times and its former publisher and the current editor-in-chief against a Court of Appeal judgment. Just for information, Fiji Times published an article on November 7, 2011 from New Zealand's Sunday Star Times titled FIFA Probes Doc as in Dr. Samsudin Sokan, the former president of the Fiji Football Association. And he talked about, Dr. Sokan was debarred from the legal profession for life. He was given a ban for life not to practice in Fiji. And in that article that was republished in the Fiji Times, the General Secretary of the Oceania Football Federation, he said this. He's quoted as saying, quote, "You should be aware that with no judiciary there," meaning here, "his case has been reviewed by one Australian judge. It is not a court per se." Now, the matter was referred to the courts as a contempt of court proceedings because it was making comments and allegations about the Fijian judiciary. The allegation, of course, was that the newspaper scandalized the court and the judiciary. The courts have ruled, essentially, that the words published the words that were published were obviously not true, and that the Fijian judiciary had a place at that time. It was in place when the article was published, and hefty fines, of course, were subsequently imposed by the Fiji Court of Appeal, and that the appeal against that was in fact upheld. There have, of course, been in Fiji's case, been other defamation cases in respect of, through the common law system, where people have taken media organizations for defaming them or slandering them. So, ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that in Fiji, the press, of course, has no legal impediment to publication. The media generally has no impediment to publication. Of course, if they're going to try and incite people, there are, of course, cases then, of course, can be filed against them. And there is one particular case on foot which I'm not going to comment on. But I think more importantly, I'd like to look at the more sort of substantive issues facing or within the media space in Fiji today. And that is, what kind of journalism do we have? What are the points of reference do we use or do journalists use in terms of their ability to analyze information that is to become news? Because that has a huge bearing on how they actually portray that event or that news item to you. That has a huge bearing in terms of who they represent in the stories. The second point I'd like to make very briefly is, of course, again, and to reiterate, it would be very good to get the media actually doing their own analysis based on facts. And then you analyze the facts. At the moment, we have a very rudimentary basis of journalism in Fiji, and that can be substantially improved. The third and last point, which I think is very important, I believe that the journalists are working in the media organizations. Conditions of employment, the salaries that they do get paid, the level of training that they do get needs to significantly improve. And this can, of course, be done by those individual media organizations that actually employ them. And we need to actually invest in our journalists, or would-be journalists in the private sector. In the same way as we are saying, we are investing at the moment in our doctors. So anybody that does an MBBS and joins the civil service, we pay for all your postgraduate studies available at FNU. It's free, because we want to build the capacity, we want to build the specialization. That analogy, I believe, applies also to the journalism field in Fiji. So with those few words, I'd like to now conclude and urge you all to be able to understand what this means for us, the Media Freedom Day or Press Freedom Day, that we need to all read a lot more and be able to analyze this information a lot more independently and with the right facts. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.